Hey guys, welcome to AP Biology, and we are continuing our discussion of phylogenetic trees and how to interpret them. We finished off our first lecture in class, and we were looking at evidence for common ancestry, part 2. And so I'm showing you a phylogenetic tree of basically all life on this particular planet. We'll be doing a deep dive into phylogenetic trees in part 3 of this, and also in the coming classes. But as you can see on this phylogenetic tree, we can see that there are the three main domains of organisms on this planet. We have the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryota, or the eukaryotes, such as ourselves. And that they all come back to a single point in what we call LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. And we believe that organism was somewhere about 3.8 to maybe 4 billion years ago. Okay, so kind of cool. People might say, "Oh, I'm not related to an ape." No, you're related to a roach or a bacteria. Okay, which I think is kind of cool. Anyways, here we go, looking at the evidence that we have for common ancestry. We base our evidence on several different means of, or lines of evidence, I should say. We make this claim that all life is related to each other. And it's based on geographic distributions, the fossil record, similarities amongst living species, and of course, patterns of variation amongst both living and extinct organisms. So biogeography. Okay, this is something that Darwin first noticed when he was traveling between 1830 and 1835. He noticed that animals that were found in South America resembled each other more so than animals that were living in England compared to animals that were living in South America. Darwin was lucky. He went all the way around the world, one of the first scientists to really actually do that. And he noticed these patterns of different types of organisms. He found lots of things like armadillos in South America, but they didn't have armadillos in England. Also, he found some fossils of very large armadillos in South America. He also found things like large birds, flightless birds like rheas, which once again did not occur in England. He knew about ostriches in Africa, but rheas and ostriches are very different. And he also knew a little bit about emus that are found in places like New Guinea, along with cassowaries, which are found also in New Guinea and in Australia. So I got two examples up here. We have hummingbirds and penguins. Hummingbirds are nectar-feeding birds that are only found in the New World. What's the New World? That's the Americas, North, Central, and South America. They are not found in the Old World, which consists of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Okay. Another example, penguins. They are found in Antarctica, not the Arctic. But in the Old World, okay, excuse me here, my slide's not moving. Okay, in the Old World, we do have sunbirds. Sunbirds are ecological equivalents of hummingbirds. They are nectar feeders, they can hover and do all sorts of things, but they are not closely related to hummingbirds. They have their own lineage. We find sunbirds in Africa, we find them in Asia, we find them in Southern Europe. Okay? We also find auks in the Arctic, but not the Antarctic. You might be familiar with the puffin. The puffin is a small auk. Okay, and there's several different species of puffins, and there's also other types of birds that are called auks. Also, you wouldn't know. But then there was also a species called the great auk, and this one stood about 3 feet tall, like a penguin, and it went extinct during the time of whalers in New England, as the whalers would go to their rookeries there where they nested and would steal all their eggs to have fresh eggs on their ships and stuff, and that basically led to their extinction I think somewhere in the 1800s. Okay, but they are found in the Arctic and not the Antarctic, but they look similar. So how can two species that are not closely related begin to look similar? That's a process we call convergent evolution, where similar environmental pressures, environmental niches, and things like that lead to similar adaptations in organisms over time. Now, can a sunbird ever mate with a hummingbird or an auk with a penguin? No. They are not closely related. They have different chromosome numbers and things of that nature, different behaviors. So there's lots of different reproductive isolating mechanisms that keep these species separate, but the environmental conditions led to similar adaptations. Okay. We also have fossil evidence, and fossils evidence show great transitions from species into one species into another or into a whole plethora of different species. The diagram to the right here represents the phylogeny of whales, and as you can see, the early whales were called mesocynids, and those animals were dog-like land four-legged creatures. Okay, and we see this whole evolutionary time scale laid out going from about 50 million years ago up to the present day, where we have two major groups of whales: the mysticetes, which are the baleen whales, and of course the odontocetes, which are the toothed whales. Um, and when I say geographically, we find similar fossils in similar places. We see, so we might find fossils of armadillo, large extinct armadillos in South America, where armadillos evolved, and we don't find them in North America. Now, we do have armadillos in North America, but that's because they expanded northwards from their point of origin in somewhere in South America. Okay, we find similar fossils in similar aged rock strata. That's our temporally, and similar fossils with, we see a progression of morphs of shapes leading from one to the other, like from the Pakicetus to Amblyocetus to so on and so on, in similar locations. And whale evolution is best documented in the deserts of Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, parts of Egypt, because that used to be a wide, shallow sea basin. Okay, so fossils are great pieces of evidence. We have great evidence for whale evolution, horse evolution, human evolution, lots of different organisms we can look at. Also, what we call deep similarity, and where distantly related organisms share structural similarities despite their differing functions. So what you are looking at here is the one bone, the humerus, the two bones, the radius and ulna, the many bones, the tarsals of the wrist, and then the metatarsals or the phalanges. So one bone, two bones, many bones, digits. One bone, two bones, many bones, digits. One bone, two bones, many bones, digits. Now, in the bat, it looks like only one bone. It's actually fused. Same thing we can see in a horse foreleg and many of the other hoofed animals. Those two bones are fused into a single bone, and that can actually be teased out when you look at them very closely. Okay, so this all is evidence for common origin. For this bone pattern to actually have evolved independently is pretty much statistically impossible. Okay, and this is something that Charles Darwin noticed when he gave his fossils to a famous British anatomist named Richard Owen. And Richard Owen showed him a diagram looking at all these various vertebrate fossils, and Darwin looked at it, and he was just amazed at the similarity between the different skeletons and the same bones. And again, that was a piece of evidence for him, for his theory of natural selection, and that all organisms evolved from a common ancestor. Now, Richard Owen, who was deeply religious, said it was the eye of the creator that caused this similarity to occur. Okay, but again, we cannot use that in a scientific explanation. Another good example of deep similarity is looking at brains. So the different colored regions on this diagram, going from a dogfish shark to a horse, and a human is even more so like this, we see this different colors represent the same regions of the brain. And we can see how the cerebrum becomes enlarged as we kind of move to more, I don't want to say more complex, but more to larger animals with larger brains, we see that this region of the brain becomes much, much enlarged. Okay, but the basic structure of the brain is the same. We have the spinal cord coming into the cerebellum, and the optic lobes are our optic lobes, as is the horses and the small mammals, are hidden underneath the cerebrum. Okay, we have an olfactory tract and olfactory bulbs. On the horse, you can see it right there. Ours is much, much, much reduced. Okay, and so on and so on, but a very similar structure in the brain. So I want you to pause for a second, read this question, and see if you can answer it. Hopefully, you got the correct answer of B. Okay, which of the following most clearly supports the common ancestry of all living vertebrates? A is incorrect. Okay, because we're only talking about vertebrates that live in caves, not all vertebrates. Okay, C is also incorrect because it says most non vertebrate animals have no eyes or simpler eyes that can just detect light and darkness. This is not, again, not telling us anything about the common ancestry amongst living organisms. But in B, what we see is that in all vertebrate eyes, the nerve cells are in front of the retina, meaning that light must pass through the nerves before hitting the retina. So that's a common feature we see in all living vertebrates. And it gives you the information again that octopuses, which are invertebrates, they have a different structure. So the only one that looks at that structure is answer B. We see that also with molecular data. We're looking here at cytochrome C. This is the amino acid sequence in cytochrome C. Okay, and we're only looking at a portion of it. I can't fit the whole thing on there. And so we're looking at algae, plants, trypanosomes, which are a type of protist, animals, different types of fungi, bacteria, and archaean, which are also prokaryotes. Okay, what I want you to notice, and again, what is cytochrome C? It's a protein that's found in the electron transport chain, so it's extremely important because it helps us make ATP. Okay, and if this was non-functional, we wouldn't be able to make ATP. And what we see is when we look at this vast array of organisms, that there's a lot of similarity. These are the single letter codes for amino acids. So things V would be like valine, and F would be phenolphthalein, and or phenylalanine, and I can't remember what they all are. But anyways, we see that they're the same color in many places for all of the organisms, and for many they're it's maybe just the very simplest ones, like the bacterium and the archaea are the same, and then the more advanced eukaryotic organisms have something a little bit slightly different. But we see the same amino acid in the same place in many cases. So that's an example of evidence with using molecular data. Okay. And here's some other evidence. Again, molecular similarities show a single origin of life. All organisms that we know of on this planet use both DNA and RNA, okay, in order to encode information. All organisms on this planet use the same subset of 20 to 21 amino acids in order to build proteins. And there's this thing it says up here, same handedness. They can be either right-handed molecules or they can be left-handed molecules. And when you get into chemistry, you'll learn about that unless you already know about it. But all living organisms use left-handed molecules. The genetic code, the codon chart, is the same for all living organisms. We all use ribosomes, which are slightly different between bacteria or prokaryotes and eukaryotes, but otherwise they are the same. They do the same function. I can take a eukaryotic piece of DNA and have a prokaryotic ribosome read it, and vice versa. I can have a eukaryotic ribosome read some prokaryotic DNA and create a protein. All living organisms use ATP as the molecule of energy. And we also share many, many different genes that are very, very similar across the broad spectrum of life. All of these are molecular similarities that show that life probably evolved once or came about once and then has diversified over the 4 billion years or so that critters have been around on this planet. Okay. And when we classify organisms, you can think about it, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and things like that. Those are nested hierarchies where domain is the largest one. Remember, there's 3 domains to life. There's the archaea, the bacteria, and the eukaryotes. And then we have 7 to 15 kingdoms. That number is variable because the protists are going to get split up into a bunch. Anyways, but it's a nested hierarchy. So as you notice see on this diagram, all organisms have a vertebral column. So we can classify those put those into a single circle. Now, only 4 of those organisms up there have 4 legs and lungs. So they are in a different nested circle. Okay? Only 3 of them have what we call an amniotic egg. What's an amniotic egg? It's an adaptation that allowed for organisms to lay their eggs on land. Okay, it's a type of membrane that we find inside the eggshell. Why do fish and toads not have them? Because they lay their eggs in water. They don't have to worry about their eggs dehydrating or desiccating on land. So only 3 of those organisms have an amniotic egg, and only 2 have fur and produce milk, and that would be all mammals. And that's something that all mammals share. They all have fur, and even whales have some little bit of hairs. They all produce milk. Yes, whales the females have teats, and they do produce milk, and the young whales, baby whales, do suckle from their mother underwater. Okay, here's another interpretation. This is our segue into phylogenetic trees. It's just showing the same relationship. I took this diagram and converted it into a phylogenetic tree. Okay, so here is my fish, and here is my vertebral column. This shows that from this point onwards, including the fish, all organisms have a vertebral column. Okay, then we see 4 legs and 4 lungs. From this point onward, all organisms have 4 legs and lungs. And then we see amnion. From this point forward, all organisms have an amniotic egg. Yes, we do have amniotic eggs as humans. Okay, and from here, only from here forward, do we see that the organisms from here onwards are going to have both fur and milk. So this fur and milk had to evolve between this point and this point. Okay, amniotic egg had to evolve between here and here. And of course, the 4 legs and lungs evolved from here to here. Okay, now if organisms evolved independently, then we might see all of these, we could have fish with fur because, fish live in cold water. Fur would be beneficial there. Okay, but they don't. All right. And so if they all evolved independently, then we should see random patterns of traits, and we'd have this weird nested hierarchy, and we know that doesn't work. Okay, there's no way that could happen. It's statistically impossible for random to see all of these characteristics only found in certain organisms and not in others. Okay. And so I want to kind of sort of leave you guys with the idea that common ancestry is established beyond a reasonable doubt, and this is why there's a single science of biology. And to leave you with a quote from Thomas Dobzhansky, who was the creator of the modern synthesis of biology, of evolutionary biology back in the 1930s, he basically says, biology only makes sense in the light of evolution. And that's the end of lecture part 2. Okay. And I thank you guys, and we'll get to